Let's start off. Transportation is half of the emissions in Washington State. Gas is a killer. If we can't make it illegal, we can at least label it. I'd like to introduce Mr. Rob Shirkey, director of Our Horizon, to share his great idea on labeling gas pumps.
Thank you so much. I'm incredibly grateful to be here. I'm from Toronto, Canada, and I'm just on the West Coast for the next 3 weeks, and this is incredibly serendipitous, so thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Of course, my actual logo is a Canadian maple leaf, but I'm in Seattle, so how can I not, and hopefully this clicker works. Maybe? Am I pointing it somewhere? We'll see if you know what, if I just point at you every time I point, then what? Yeah, okay. All right, so we'll do the old pointing. All right, so I'm sure two quick slides on climate change so we're all on the same page. What is an ice core sample? Real quick, someone shout it out. You guys know in the front, I'm sure, Planet from Planet. Ice core sample, yeah. Brilliant, that's exactly it. And so by looking at these ice core samples, that record goes back over 800,000 years, and from that record we know that the historic range of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere goes from 180 to 300 parts per million. If I were to take a fistful of air in this room and measure it for CO2, what would I get? Yeah, 400. So really where we're at today is unprecedented for all intents and purposes, for all human history. Next slide, thank you. So 3 quick numbers, and some of you guys might already know this, but in 2009 in Copenhagen, the world got together at one of these climate change talks and said, we're going to limit the average temperature increase since the Industrial Revolution to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. That's the political target, and as we've heard today, there's a lot of scientists that say, well, it's actually quite dangerous. What this does, in effect, is it creates a ceiling on temperature increase. Working backwards from that, scientists ask the question, well, how many fossil fuels, how much fossil fuels can we burn, how much CO2 can we emit before we commit to this 2-degree temperature increase? And they came up with this figure, 565 gigatons worth of carbon dioxide. I've seen numbers that are slightly higher, slightly lower, but the takeaway is you set a cap on temperature increase, you necessarily then create what is in effect a carbon budget. The last figure on this series is 2,795, and that actually comes from a group of financial analysts. They looked at basically, so Shell's books, Exxon's books, all of these annual reports from these companies to look at their assets to find their proven reserves, so the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas they've identified as being under the ground and they intend on bringing to market to extract for us to use in a variety of ways. They added all those figures together to get a sense of well, what is global proven reserves. And this is the amount that we have on the books. That's the status quo game plan, which circle is bigger, guys? Right? So we're in a bit of a pickle. Next slide. A lot of you will know, and there's a lot of people from 350 here. So Bill McKibben notes we have 5 times as much oil and coal and gas on the books as climate scientists think is safe to burn. We'd have to keep 80% of those reserves locked away underground to avoid that fate. And Barack Obama recently was quoted as having said, we're not going to be able to burn it all. I very much believe in keeping that 2 degrees Celsius target as a goal. So we find ourselves in this position where there's all sorts of wonderful solutions, clean technology, renewable energy we can transition to, but we're kind of stuck on this status quo, this unsustainable model. And I ask, well, how can we sort of challenge the status quo to help this transition? And a real easy way to do that, low cost, it's just a sticker. Why not put climate change and air pollution labels on gas pumps? Next. And we heard James Hansen. We've received over 100 endorsements since launching this campaign from academics from universities all across North America. You can see that list at ourhorizon.org. James Hansen, one of the most prominent scientists, has endorsed this idea, so it's starting to get traction. I like to say climate change can be understood as 3 different issues, and I'll explain how the label actually helps us address it. So first, click. Climate change can be understood as a problem of no feedback. What is it? What do I mean by that? Does anyone want to guess? Yeah. That's kind of it. That's kind of close. You say something about it, nobody answers. I'm going to suggest, it's kind of a delay between cause and effect. You burn fossil fuels today, and of course there's a lot of harms that we experience down the road. But there's a delay between cause and effect. There's no feedback. Unlike if I put my hand on a hot stove, I get this instant feedback and I remove it. It's sort of an adaptive behavior. And psychologists know, they call it the current moment bias. So it's this human tendency to prefer interests that are small and near in time relative to those that are significant but down the road. It's one of the reasons we procrastinate. All this idea does is it uses image and text to counteract that current moment bias. It brings those faraway consequences, like we heard many today, into the here and now. So it takes a problem of no feedback, and it builds feedback. And interestingly, back to Barack Obama, he says one of the hardest things in politics is getting a democracy to deal with something now where the payoff is long-term, where the price of inaction is decades away. But imagine if you could create the social environment where we feel a little more connected to this problem's closer. You're then making it easier for politicians to take action on this issue. Second, I like to say, this is a big word here, diffusion of responsibility. But does anyone want to guess what I mean by climate change is a problem of diffusion of responsibility? Yes?
Lots of people are saying it's not our fault, we didn't cause this, so how can we turn it around?
What's your name?
Right?
Grace is brilliant. That's exactly it. Thank you, Grace. So that's it. We're saying it's not our fault because responsibility for this problem is diffuse. It's shared among many. And social psychologists know, so I contribute a little bit, you contribute a little bit, you contribute a little bit. And as individuals, our contribution to the problem is small, but collectively, of course, we're altering the chemistry of our planet. And social psychologists know that when responsibility for something is shared among many, when it's diffuse, we're actually less likely to act. And they've run all sorts of experiments, and that sort of plays out time after time. And I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to have a quiz here. How many people have taken a CPR course? Show your hands. Okay, so here's a quiz. The fix to this problem is actually very simple. Let's say, if I were to give someone CPR right now on the ground, would I say, somebody, anybody, please call 911, or would I say, you, Grace, and we're making eye contact, you call 911 and get back to me when you do. What is it? Is it A or B?
B.
B, and why?
Because Grace is cool.
That is exactly it. 97% of scientists agree that Grace is cool. And that burning of fossil fuels causes climate change. But, so clearly then, all of a sudden, we've taken responsibility for intervention, we've concentrated it. Grace is going to come. So we're more likely to respond. All this idea does, quite simply, is it takes a problem of diffuse origins and it locates responsibility right in the palm of your hand. And as simple as this intervention is, I challenge you to think of anything like this out there that connects us to this problem in quite a direct way. So it really is revolutionary. So it takes a problem of diffuse origins, locates responsibility. The last, so Grace, what is externalities? I know, sorry. I'm putting you on the spot, sorry. Real quick, just a general definition. It's this idea from economics. Yes?
Basically, something that happens in the world that has no cost associated.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I'll illustrate that by way of an example. So, let's say a gallon of gasoline costs $2 at the pump, which I guess price is going lower and lower, and it's probably ballpark this. So there's actually a variety of costs that the producer had to incur in order to bring that product to market for us, the consumer, to use. So there was some labor involved in that process. There were some machines that had to be used, some energy as well went into that, so the costs of the producer go higher and higher. Product had to be shipped, it had to be refined, it had to be brought to an individual retailer. There's a profit margin on top of that, and taxes. All of that informs that sort of signal to the marketplace of the value, the worth, the cost of that product. But we know that there are a lot of externalities, a lot of hidden costs. So as we learned today from Kids from Plants for the Planet, well, you burn fossil fuels, that causes warming. That might cause, say, melting glaciers, it causes a rise in sea level. We then have to spend collectively billions of dollars to adapt our coastal infrastructure to deal with those problems. So we know that there are some costs that are externalized, like we're going to have to adapt our coastal infrastructure. There's some other costs we heard, farming, so it might be harder to grow crops, so there's a hit to agriculture. Maybe extreme weather is causing some property damage, and so on and so on. The costs go higher and higher. What economists say is we need to internalize that cost, and there are some people from Citizens Climate Lobby that are working on this. So as soon as we see the true cost, as soon as these hidden costs are revealed to the marketplace, we're less interested in this solution, more interested in others. The segue to this project, if you think about it, so what this idea tries to achieve by using dollars and cents in this quantitative approach, this idea tries to achieve using image and text in this qualitative approach. So in the abstract, they're both communicating externalities to the marketplace, but they're using a different language to do that. Does that make sense, Grace? She nodded yes. Okay, so they're using a different language to kind of do the same thing in the abstract. What I think is particularly interesting about this is how it engages our sense of humanity. One more click, please. And there's a really interesting study that I like to ground this in. It comes from a series of daycares in Israel. And so I'm going to need one volunteer for this. Yeah? Okay, thanks. What's your name? Athena. So Athena's my volunteer. So Athena runs a daycare. How old are you? She's 11 and she's looking after your kids that are 9 at her daycare. And so I got so I send my kids to Athena's daycare and I pay her maybe, we'll say $300 a week, and this is our contract, this is what we've agreed to. But I'm terrible, I come late, so I'm supposed to come at 4 to pick up my kids, I'm coming late, I'm coming at 4:15, 4:30, I'm sending emails at work and saying, oh, I'll be there, but I end up being late, right? And so the external cost to my behavior is poor Athena, she's having to change her social plans, she's canceling dinner plans and so on. So what economists did is they said, well, let's price that harm, let's price that externality. So for every minute I'm late, I owe Athena, I owe her daycare, $1. So if I'm late 15 minutes, I owe them $15. A half hour, I owe them $30. So what do you guys think happened to behavior? Do you think, A, people started to come more on time because they were incentivized to do that? Okay. And do you think, B, there was no change at all? Does anyone think C, parents became later? Yeah, it's actually C, which is really curious. And so behavioral economists sometimes observe that when you price externalities, you change the thinking. So before, I felt this accountability to Athena, well, I really should be there on time, I don't want to ruin her social plans. But after, now I can just pay her. So while we definitely do need to price carbon, and there are some amazing groups that are working on this, I think this is a nice complement to that. Behavioral economists, they say that sometimes when pricing these things, you switch off these moral cues that otherwise regulate behavior, sort of control that relationship. So this is a nice complement to that, and again, it's a gateway. It can sort of change the social environment to make this discussion a little bit more possible. Next slide. So it takes a problem of externalities, communicates it. Next slide. So what do I think this idea will do? I think at its core, it's disruptive. And the story I like to tell on this, so my poor mom, ever since I started this not-for-profit organization, I run experiments on my mother. One experiment that I ran on her was, I was showing up for breakfast, and I'm trying to catch her on the morning when her fuel gauge would be close to empty. And so I'm showing up for breakfast, and she, oh Rob, you're such a lovely son, you're visiting me more and more, you're having breakfast. And really I have this ulterior motive, she's my guinea pig. Finally I catch her on a day when her gas gauge is close to empty, and so I say, in all likelihood, she's gonna gas up today. And so I say, hey mom, we're having such a great time spending, how about I come over for dinner? And she, you're such a good boy, Rob. So I come over for dinner, and of course before I go in, I check her fuel gauge, and it's right at full. So I know that she gassed up during the day. I asked her during the course of dinner, how was your day? It was great. Where all did you go today? Well, I went to work, I got groceries, I came home. Where else did you go anywhere else? Well, she repeats that, and I went to work, I got groceries. Did you stop for any reason? Did you get out of your car for any other, even a second? No. Eventually the questions get narrower and narrower. Did you by chance stop at a gas station? And she pauses. Yeah, I did, sure, I gassed up. So my thinking is, right now, this simple act, it's been normalized for generations. It doesn't even register as an activity. And if that's the situation downstream, if we collectively as consumers do this, it's really harder to change things upstream. So the thinking is, what this idea does is it denormalizes this thing. It forces us at the pump to be, well, what are we supposed to do? If not this, then what? And by forcing, that's exactly what we want to do. We want people to be upset with this idea. And then all of a sudden, it stimulates demand for alternatives. So by challenging the status quo, by creating a bit of dissatisfaction with the status quo, you stimulate demands for alternatives. One, you'll see you'll see politicians have more political freedom to propose all sorts of things. You'll also see businesses respond, because if we're problematizing the status quo solution, if all of a sudden we're less and less happy with our existing automobiles, an automaker is going to say, well, look, here's the share of the marketplace. They're not being catered to. They're not satisfied. We need to invest research and development dollars into bringing to market some of these other solutions, because now there's broader demand for it. And of course, through economies of scale, if you can generate more and more demand, prices then come down. So things like electric vehicles will be in at a better price point. So there might be some individual behavioral change, but I'm also interested in this collective piece. Next slide. Real quick, so we can hit maybe the button a couple times. So in 1908, the Ford Model T, it was the first vehicle mass-produced to come off the assembly line. This is Canadian, we use kilometers. I'm a Canadian. So 6 to 9 kilometers per liter. The takeaway though is notice over the course of a century how little fuel economy has changed. So if you can hit it again, above the line is what makes it to market, below the line is what doesn't make it to market. There's a competition hosted by Shell, they call it the Eco Marathon, and they challenge high school students and university students all over the world to design the most fuel-efficient vehicles they can. Believe it or not, so this runs on a hydrogen fuel cell, but they did an equivalency on it, and it actually gets over 5,000 kilometers per liter. This was created by high schoolers. I like it because it reminds me of the Oscar Mayer hot dog Wienermobile. Anyone? Yeah. It wasn't even the best in its category, but it's hilarious. And it got 930 kilometers per liter. This one does actually run on gasoline. In 2013, it was in the gasoline prototype category, the vehicle that won the European competition got 3,000 kilometers per liter. How are they doing it? Well, the designs, they're very, very light, they're low to the ground, they're aerodynamic. The point I'm trying to make here is we don't necessarily have to go to this place, and of course, there's electric vehicles and all sorts of other solutions. We don't have to necessarily go here, but notice what we have done, and the idea is we can do a lot better. We actually can. Like, this is at the extreme end of efficiency, that's at the extreme end of inefficiency. Who can sort of plug in the missing word here? Blank is the mother of invention. Something is the mother of invention. Right? All this idea does is it injects a little more necessity into the system. So there's then more impetus to transition to these places. Next slide. One last thing to think about. So in the broader context, there's some really important campaigns going on the tar sands, some really important campaigns, some anti-pipeline campaigns, some really important anti-tanker campaigns. But we tend not to actually ask this question, how do we use fossil fuels? The focus tends to be upstream, not so much downstream. I think that's in part because, it's one thing to sort of reflect the mirror upstream and say, well, the problem's over there. It's another thing to sort of reflect the mirror downstream and say, oh, we're maybe all collectively involved in this. And that can create discomfort, but again, a bit of discomfort is good. Complacent markets don't change. If you can create a bit of dissatisfaction in a marketplace with the existing solution, that's where transformation comes. So it's important that we ask this question in complement with all these other important campaigns. And the last little bit to drive home on this is, so this is interesting. I find this fascinating. They call it a well-to-wheel analysis of greenhouse gas emissions. So well, from point of extraction here on the x-axis, to wheel, point of use. And they're measuring emissions from extracting the product, moving the product, refining the product, using the product. So if you can click it, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare Canadian oil sands to Canadian conventional crude. So dirty oil versus regular oil. And who's heard, the tar sands are 3-4 times as dirty as regular oil. And that is very true. But it's only true of this upstream area. So if you click it once, maybe I think or twice. So notice when it comes to the extraction process, yeah, it has a significantly greater greenhouse gas footprint. But you have to take it as a percentage of the overall sort of the life cycle. And if you click it again, you see, well, what is this blue stuff? One more time. and it's a vehicle operation, and we probably know that intuitively. It is problematic when we extract this stuff, and there's a lot of problems associated with it. And yes, it is problematic when we move it. There's a lot of risks involved there. When it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, though, it's when we light it on fire, it's when we combust it. That's where the vast majority of emissions come from. The good news is, we can make a lot of progress on these blue bars. So that's what's exciting. And, next slide. One more just to really drive point the home. How disconnected are we? We don't even see it. These pumps were very common in the 20s and 30s. You would actually, with this hand pump or electric motor, you would fill up a clear cylinder and you would see how much of the thing you're consuming. And then, gravity would just flow it down the pipe into your car. And so you had this sense of, okay, I'm putting this thing into the car, where does it go? You might be more connected to the problem. There's a product, there's emissions, I refill every so often. Now we don't even see it. So I think we're really disconnected from it, and there's value to making us feel more connected to the problem. The last little bit, does this place look familiar? Right? This is us here. So we're asking cities and towns to show leadership by pursuing this, by trying to require gas retailers to put this on their gas pumps. Good news is Berkeley's doing this, San Francisco is doing this, Santa Monica is coming on board next. In Canada, West Vancouver is pursuing this. Guelph is going to be introducing this soon, so a smaller community near where I'm from. There's some communities on the East Coast. And what I foresee happening is cities and towns across North America bringing this forward, and then it's spreading. And when communities lead, it becomes that much easier for others to follow. Last slide is this, and this is the vision. So, it was actually in the early 60s, President Kennedy, your president, said, well, we need to study tobacco and figure out conclusively, is this a harmful product? Does it cause cancer? And so he asked a scientist to come back with a report. They said, yes, it did. And it was a year after that, so I think it was 1964, you guys became the first jurisdiction in the world to require the warning labels on tobacco products. Canada added one more piece, we put an image on it many, many years later, but the concept actually comes from the United States. And it's had quite an impact, it saved a lot of lives, and it's spread all over the world. This is an image of the places that have the tobacco warning labels. If you could click one more time. Believe it or not, so I run a small organization, it's really just me. I have a WordPress website. This is our analytics. People all over the world have visited this, and I think it's because we've been cognitively primed with this example. I get tweets from all over the world, posts on Facebook, people saying, oh, this is exactly like what we do with our tobacco packages. How do we get this done here? So the game plan is to show leadership in North American communities over the next year. And I'm going to go to Paris. We heard that there's a climate change conference, an important one, in December. I want to take to Paris examples of your leadership and tell delegates from all over the world, look, here's the simple, low-cost thing that communities in North America, like Seattle, are doing. Why not take this to your place? And imagine if all over the world we could feel a little closer to this problem, a little more responsible for it. If we could take these hidden costs and make them visible, how much more of an impetus it might be for us collectively to really address this problem. So thank you.